gene. That's the key word, one gene. Not all the DNA, but one gene, that is transcription. If the final gene product is a protein, what kind of RNA did you make?
RNA.
mRNA. Are there other gene products besides proteins, though?
Yeah.
Yes. And if your final gene product is anything other than a protein, then the final product is the RNA that you make, rRNA or tRNA or whatever. So you should know the function of each of the different kinds of RNAs. So how do you initiate, elongate, and terminate transcription? That means how do you get it started? How do you do it? How do you make the thing you're making longer? And how do you end it? You initiate by what? You have a section of DNA that has a gene. That's what we want to make a copy of. Just ahead of the gene, there's a region called a promoter. And what binds to the promoter? Proteins called transcription factors. And you have to have the right set of transcription factors. You'll learn lots more about all the details in genetics. But particular transcription factors have to be there. If they are there, then what else comes in?
Enzyme.
The one enzyme you need to do transcription, which is? You're making RNA, which is a polymer. So the enzyme is called RNA polymerase. Okay? And there's different RNA polymerases depending on whether you're making tRNA or mRNA or rRNA. That's a detail. I won't test you on that. But
so which one does the proteins again? Is it RNA or mRNA that does the proteins?
If you're making a protein, what do you make first? What has the information in it that tells you the order of amino acids?
AAT.
The mRNA does. And what do you call the sequences of 3 nucleotides at a time that you read?
Groups.
Codons. Codons. What pairs up with the codon to bring the right amino acid in at the right time? If in my mRNA I have a sequence that's A, U, G, C, 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 A, U, C, then what pairs up with this? This is my mRNA, so what will come here? A tRNA that has UAC and a particular amino acid. So what pairs up with a codon in the mRNA? The anticodon in a tRNA. Why do we care? Because when that happens, did we just bring in the right amino acid at the right time? The mRNA tells you when to bring it in. Who actually brings it in? The tRNA. Okay? How do you elongate? A tRNA would come in and read the next. What's this? Codon. And it would have an anticodon that pairs up with it. When you look at the chart to see what amino acid does this carry, do I want to look up the anticodon or the codon?
The codon.
The codon. It's a codon chart. All right. And then, so you'd look it up. I don't know what this one is. And maybe it's lysine. Okay?
How do you know when to like?
Now, where am I right now? I'm in a... This is all taking place in what machine does translation? Oh, we're talking about translation now, not transcription. But we got a little ahead of ourselves.
Sorry.
Okay. So what are we doing right now? What process is this? Translation or transcription? Translation. How do you know?
It's counting the 3.
Because we're reading the mRNA. We're not making the mRNA. If you're making the mRNA, it is transcription. If you're reading it and you're making a what? Protein, then it's translation. Okay? So that's the next question. How do you elongate? How do you do the elongation step of translation?
You read it.
Who's doing it? What's this machine? The ribosome. What positions? The ribosome has 3 sites. 1, 2, 3 in it. Where do you have your growing protein? P site. Where do you have your next amino acid to add? A site. What kind of bond will I form between those 2 amino acids? Peptide bonds. You guys are good. And then you'll keep doing, once I form that bond, the ribosome shifts down. So now this tRNA will be in the P site, and the A site will be open. I'll be ready to read the next codon. You keep doing that until you hit a what? Stop codon, and that's how you terminate.
How do you know when to like use U, like translate U for A? Like when you do RNA, like how you went to like.
You don't translate U for A. That would be an incorrect way to say it. But do you mean, how do you know when to use A and when to use U and when to use T? Who can answer that?
I don't know.
Yeah, it depends on which molecule you're talking about. T's are only in which nucleic acid? DNA. So both DNA and RNA use A's, C's, and G's. The difference is the A is just the base part of the nucleotide. So I have an A attached to my 5-carbon sugar and a phosphate group. If this is a DNA A, then I have a hydrogen here. If it's an RNA A, I have an OH there. This is ribose RNA. If I don't have an oxygen there, it's deoxyribose. But they both use A bases. They both use C bases. They both use G bases. If I've got DNA, I wouldn't ever attach a U. I would attach a T. If it's an RNA nucleotide, it would have U's.
So
Okay.
in transcription, when you do RNA, you usually do U or T. That makes sense.
It would have to be U because it's an RNA. As soon as you say RNA, you know it's a U. So if you see a strand of nucleotides and it's got T's in it, you know right away, even if it's single-stranded, it's DNA. I just haven't shown you the other strand. If it's got U's in it, it doesn't. If I give you a strand of DNA and I say, what's the RNA strand you could make from it, then you would make it complementary and put U's in instead of T's. Okay? All right. Any other questions about transcription and translation? Okay. Sweet. You guys are awesome. You've been studying. All Thanksgiving you were thankful for biology, right? Okay. Now we are ready to start evolution. So you are just getting an overview. But we're going to give you a very good overview so you understand the basic processes of what happens in evolution. And there are a few key words that you're going to want to know. So we'll write them down as we go. But to begin with, I just want to start with a story. This phrase here is how Darwin described the diversity of life in his book. What was his book? I always forget this when I get to this part. On the Origin of Species. Okay, is what it was called. And I think that was just very poetic and beautiful. There are endless forms most beautiful, or a great diversity of life on Earth. What's different about each of the different organisms on Earth? They are each uniquely adapted to their own particular environment. They're really good at living where they live. How come? Because of the forces of evolution have enabled each species to become adapted to its own environment. That's what we're going to learn about. Here is an example of a cool adaptation. These little beetles are called headstander beetles. They live in the Sahara Desert. Is there much water there? No, but everything requires water to live. So how does this little headstander beetle get a drink every morning? Can it just hike over to the mountains over here?
No.
20 miles away? No, it's a little beetle. It can't go that far. So what it has evolved to do is, you know that deserts get cold at night, and the Sahara is close to the Mediterranean Sea. And so cool breezes come in off the ocean that have some moisture, and the water comes in, you hit the different air temperatures, it makes water condense. And so water condenses on the body of this headstander beetle. So in the morning, when the temperature is changing, he climbs up to the top of a sand dune, the wind hits it, and a little bit of moisture condenses on his body. But that's still no good because he needs to drink it. So he has little grooves in his legs, and then he stands on his head, and that directs all the water down into his mouth.
Wow.
And he gets his drink for the day.
That's cool.
Is that a pretty cool adaptation?
Yeah.
Would this be a good adaptation if this beetle lived in the rainforest?
No.
No, why not? Yeah, it doesn't need it, so it would either just be a waste of time, or it could even potentially be dangerous. All right, if you have tracts leading to your mouth and it's raining all the time, are you going to be kind of drowning all the time? Now, beetles are different than us in how they breathe and all that, but still, you kind of get the idea, right? So each organism is uniquely adapted to its own particular environment. What does it mean to be adapted? So here is another example. endless forms most beautiful. At this point when I made this PowerPoint, there had been 385,000, roughly, species of just beetles that have been identified on the Earth. Different species. What does it mean to be a species? We are going to use the biological species definition. So species can be defined in different ways. The kind of definition we are going to use is the biological definition, which means we define a species as being a group of individuals that can and will mate with each other. That's the first thing. They have to be able to mate with each other. And the second thing is they have kids that are also fertile and can mate with each other and produce offspring. That is the biological species definition, and that's how we will define them. So there's 385,000 different species of beetles. Here are some examples. Why are they different species? Say it loud. Partly, but based on our definition we just gave, why would they be different species? What can you conclude? Yeah, they don't mate with each other. If they did mate with each other, then they would be considered the same species. All right, now that also, all the species definitions, they kind of overlap and can get a little loose. We mean this, they won't mate with each other naturally in the wild. Like lions and tigers are different species. But can a lion and a tiger mate?
Yeah.
Yes, because we had that liger up at the zoo for many, many years. Okay, so they can, but we mean under normal conditions, they won't mate with each other. All right, so here I'm just showing you some of the diversity of life just in beetles. These are different kinds of beetles. And like you said, they have slightly different characteristics because they all live in different environments. They're adapted to survive in their own particular environment. But they're all beetles. What do they have that's the same? They all have how many legs? 6 legs, definition of a beetle or any insect. And they have 3 body regions, a head, a thorax, and then the abdominal region. And so all of them have that in common. That's why they're all beetles. But they're adapted to different kinds of environments. And you can see we have great diversity of them. How'd you like to find that guy in your bed at night? Okay? So all I'm trying to show you here is the diversity of life. What kind of an environment do you think this guy lives in? What do you think he eats for a living?
Wood, like a tree branch.
Okay, you might say wood because there's woody stuff around here. But look at what he looks like.
Green.
Does he look like a beetle or does he look like a spider?
Neither.
He's kind of hairy like a spider. He has these big eyes that look kind of like compound eyes even though they're not. And I don't know about this beetle, but I would conclude this guy probably eats spiders. And he's trying to look like a spider to get spiders to come by and say, you're kind of interesting spider. Why are you there? And then it jumps out and eats him up. Okay? So each one is uniquely adapted to its own particular environment is the point I'm trying to make. And there's great diversity in life. So endless forms most beautiful. Here we see some of the diversity in different kinds of beetles we can get. Look at that huge guy. These super shiny guys. All these different kinds. All right? So the headstander beetle, which I just told you about, we're introducing 3 main key ideas. One is that all organisms, or each species, is adapted to survive in its own particular environment. What does adaptation mean? It's the process of the whole population having within it alleles for traits that are useful in that environment. Does that make sense? So if I'm in an environment where I need to fly, would I probably have alleles that enable me to make wings? Because that's a useful trait if you are flying. If I don't live in an environment like that, though, then I don't need to make wings. So this is adaptation, the process of beneficial traits becoming more common in what? In an individual or in a population? In a population. How does this happen? As individuals with traits that make it more likely for them to survive, as those individuals do survive and mate, what kind of traits are they going to pass on?
The same traits.
The traits that they have. So the ones that didn't have traits that made them live long enough to reproduce aren't going to reproduce, and what will happen to those traits? They'll be lost from the population. But ones that were able to survive and reproduce, what happens to those traits? Do they become more or less common in the population? More common. And so the frequency of the alleles that code for the good traits increases over time. All right, that's what it means to be adapted. It means in this population, if I take a random sample of humans, I'm probably going to have the vast majority of them are going to have big brains, they're going to have usable thumbs, they're going to have 2 legs, and all the human characteristics that you need to survive as a human. All right? Okay, the theory of evolution, we introduced the first day of class, explains 2 things, both the unity and the diversity of life. How does it explain the unity of life? What do we mean by unity?
Like we all have the same DNA code.
Yeah.
We share DNA.
What's the same about everything? Whether I'm a tree, whether I'm a banana, whether I'm a beetle, whether I'm a human, we all use DNA as our genetic code. We're all made of cells, and all cells use DNA, have ribosomes, have membranes. They all have the same basic chemistry in there. Okay? So that is the unity of life. That's one of the things that evolution explains. Why are we all so similar? Because the theory of evolution states that it's because we all were derived from some original life form and we've all inherited. This is the way you build living things, is you make cells that have these things in them. All right? Okay, so you should know examples of unity of life. And it basically gets back to that first lecture of what does it mean to be a cell, what is DNA? All right, what else does the theory explain? The diversity of life. If we're all so similar, how come we're so different? How come there's 385,000 different kinds of beetles? How come there's trees and there's all the other different kinds of life? I'm not very much like a dinosaur, okay? I'm quite different. So why are we so different? That is the diversity of life. What causes the diversity of life? Adaptations. We have acquired different adaptations over time. And so trees have different sets of alleles in them than humans do. Why?
Selective forces?
Selective forces.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? Selective forces are environmental forces that say, if I'm in an environment where I need to fly, I'm more likely to survive and reproduce if I have wings. And so the things with wings survive and reproduce, and over time, do most of the organisms in this population have wings?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is how natural selection works. Selective forces that cause this to happen. And do all organisms live in the same environment? No. And so do you have different selective forces selecting for different traits in different environments? And therefore, are you going to accumulate different sets of alleles in different environments? And therefore, the organisms in different environments become different. Now you might say, well, me and that tree both live in the exact same environment. How come we're not the same? But we're filling different niches in that environment. I'm not going to test you on this word, but a niche is, it's like a job, okay? So we have teachers here on campus and we have students here on campus. We're both here in the same environment, but are we filling different roles in this environment? Okay, you guys are ideally adapted to be students. It's a bad example, but I'm ideally adapted to be this. So trees are filling the niche of being able to photosynthesize and stand still and harvest food. I'm filling a different niche. I have to make money and go buy my food at the store and all that kind of thing. Trees don't have the alleles to be able to do that. I don't have the alleles to be able to just stand there and photosynthesize. All right? So even though we say the environments are different, you can be in different environments even if you're in the exact same place, if you're filling different environmental roles or niches. All right, so evolution explains the unity and the diversity of life. The diversity of life is due to the fact that that original life form had kids that were all pretty much the same, but it had eventually become overcrowded. And what did some of those kids do? They moved away to new places. And were the characteristics in those new places slightly different? And so was the selective forces on this half of the population different than the selective forces on this half? And over time, you can accumulate changes enough that you become different enough from each other that even if you come back together, you no longer recognize each other as the same species, meaning you no longer do what? No longer mate with each other. And ultimately, that leads to making lots of different species that are different from each other. Okay? This was Darwin's understanding of how evolution works. Do you think it's a slow or a fast process?
Slow process.
Slow. Why?
I just, over time, generations,
Where do you get new alleles from?
parents,
What is an allele?
a gene.
It's a gene. It's a variation of a gene. So it's a sequence of DNA that's almost exactly the same as this other sequence of DNA. It's the same gene, but it's just slightly different enough that I make my protein slightly different. It behaves slightly differently. Okay, where do new genes come from, or new alleles?
New organisms.
From mutations. And is the mutation rate fast or slow? Slow, very low mutation rate. So it takes time. The ultimate source of variation is mutation. Mutation causes new alleles. What causes frequencies of alleles to increase in some populations and decrease in other populations? Natural selection, which is the environmental forces acting on them in that particular environment. What might be a good trait in the Sahara Desert might be a bad trait in the rainforest, and vice versa. All right? So this is another key point. Mutations occur randomly. Organisms don't say, sometime in the future I might need to be able to do this, so I better start adapting my DNA so I'll be able to do that. None of that happens. Mutations are entirely random. But what causes some to be selected for and some to be selected against? The different environments. And what do we call that?
Diversity.
Natural selection. So here's another key idea. There are three forces. There's lots more too, but there's three major forces that enable or cause evolution to occur. One of them is natural selection. This one is so important because natural selection is the only force that causes populations to adapt over time or to become better at living in that particular environment. How does natural selection do this? Who survives long enough to reproduce? The organisms with the better traits or the organisms with the worst traits? The ones with the better traits. And when they reproduce, which traits do they pass on? Those traits. So which traits become more common in the population? Those traits. That's how evolution works. There are also two other forces. One is called genetic drift. And the other one you need to know is gene flow. These are also important forces, but they can cause you to become better adapted, but they typically don't cause you to do that. So we'll talk more about those coming up. All right, so what is evolution? All year long we've been waiting to hear what it is. And some people think there's a lot of controversy about evolution. You've maybe heard jokingly people call it evolution. All right, but what is evolution? The only reason people are scared of evolution is because they don't actually understand what evolution is. There's nothing frightening or controversial about evolution. The simple genetic definition of evolution is this. It is a change in allele frequencies in a what? An individual or a population? A population over time. Or species can change over time because as environments change, you're selecting against alleles that used to be good and for new alleles that are better. And so over time, the frequency of those better alleles becomes more common and the organisms look and behave a little different than they did before. That's what evolution is. This is the simple genetic definition of evolution, and you should know that. All right, here's a classic example. Here's little Joey, and Joey went to school, and he loves going to school, and he came home, and he's sitting at the dinner table, and he's scratching his head, and Mom says, "Quit doing that, that's gross." He says, "But my head itches." And finally she goes and looks, and what's he got? He's got some lice. And she goes, "Oh my goodness, he's got lice, oh my goodness," and has a big heart attack. But then she gets over it because she goes, "Oh, we live in America. All I need to do is go down to what? The pharmacy." Yes, and I can buy a special shampoo that has a drug in it called permethrin. So what's happening here? We have a population of lice. I'm going to show them as normal lice that like to feed on your blood, we're calling as X. But is there variation in the population?
Yeah.
There's a few that also feed on your blood and eat them, but what are they doing with the blood? They're taking this molecule, or various molecules in your blood, and they have enzymes, and they're breaking that down and turning it into stuff that they can metabolize and use and eventually produce ATP, right? Well, the X guys have a set of enzymes that are better at breaking down the blood and using it as food than the O guys do. But the O guys can still break it down. They're just not as good at it. So who do we have more of in the population? The X guys, because they're out-competing the O guys. Well, now, Mom treats Joey with permethrin shampoo, and who dies? What the permethrin does is it interferes with one of the enzymes in that pathway. And this used to be the best enzyme because you get more energy out of the food when you use this enzyme. But permethrin screws up that enzyme and makes it not work, and now you can't get any energy out of your food, so these guys are dying. O, which used to not be as good because you didn't get as much energy out of the food, this enzyme doesn't get affected by the permethrin. Is it now suddenly the best enzyme to have? Yeah. And so, in our original population, we had a high percentage of what? X's. Then what happened? The environment changed. How? We put permethrin in the environment, and now who's surviving long enough to reproduce? The O guys, and Mom's happy for a while, Joey's not scratching his head, but a couple of weeks later, is he back to scratching his head again? And is it going to do any good to buy the permethrin shampoo? No, because this population has adapted to the new environment. Now, are these guys different species? If O guys run into X guys, they're still going to recognize each other as potential mates and breed and everything. We don't have new species yet. But if these guys didn't have any interaction with X guys for 1,000,000 years, might they accumulate enough changes that now they no longer recognize each other as the same species? So ultimately, that's how evolution occurs. So what is the definition of evolution? Change in allele frequencies in a what? In a population over time. What caused the allele frequencies to change in this case?
Change the environment, yeah.
What's the name of the force? You're right, it was a change in the environment, but what's the name of the force?
Genetic drift.
Is this population better adapted to this particular environment than it was before?
No.
Yes, because there's permethrin around, and these guys can survive in permethrin. So what was the force that caused it to evolve? Natural selection, because that's the only force that I can't think of the word, regularly, there's a better word, makes you become better adapted. And so, Darwin did not discover the idea of evolution. We've talked about this before. What did he discover? The mechanism by which it occurs. And he was only focused on how do species become adapted to their environments. He didn't think about it in greater, well, he probably did think about it, but that's the big thing that he came up with. What is the mechanism by which species become better adapted to their environment? Natural selection. The simple definition of natural selection is differential reproductive success. What does that mean? What does to reproduce mean? To have kids, right? You reproduce, you had offspring. Success means you were successful in doing this. You actually produced a child. You were able to live long enough to mature sexually. You were also cool enough to find a mate, okay? And this child that you produced can potentially produce kids too. So that is reproductive success. So you produce normal kids. Differential reproductive success means what? Does everything have an equal ability to reproduce? No. And it's because of our different sets of alleles. If we're not adapted to our environment, we might not never live long enough to be able to reproduce. Or we might live long enough, but we can't attract a mate. Okay? If those are the reasons you don't reproduce, then what is the force that's causing your alleles to be lost? Natural selection. Or if those are the reasons that you do reproduce, what's the force that's causing your alleles to become more common? Also natural selection. What about if it's just bad luck? That your organism was able to reproduce and was really handsome and awesome and could have gotten a mate, but he lives on a desert island in the middle of the ocean. There's plenty of food, but there's no females. Is he going to reproduce?
No.
No. Okay? It was just bad luck. He happened to live there and he didn't ever reproduce. So even though he had great alleles, there was nothing wrong with them, did we lose them from the population?
Yeah.
That is called genetic drift. When you lose stuff just because of chance, okay? So if allele frequencies are changing due to luck, what's the force? Genetic drift. If allele frequencies are changing because there's a reason, they're better, so you're getting more of them, or they're worse, so you're getting less of them, then what's the force? Natural selection. That's the big key difference. All right? So you should know those two definitions, be able to recognize them, and don't mess them up. Evolution is allele frequencies in a population changing over time. What's the major cause of this happening so you become better adapted? Natural selection. And what's the definition? Differential reproductive success, which basically depends on did you inherit a good set of alleles or not. All right, so we've already talked about all this. The driving force that causes adaptation is natural selection. Key points to pick out. Can an individual evolve? Think of the definitions you just learned. No, because what's the definition of evolution?
Changing alleles.
Change in allele frequencies. Can I change my allele frequencies? No, you get what you get. Whatever I got from my dad and I got from my mom to make that same cell, that's what I've got to work with. And all the cells in my body have that set of alleles. Now I might get a mutation in one cell that has a little slight difference, but my whole body, I've basically got the same set. So individuals can't evolve. But individuals can either survive long enough to reproduce or fail to survive long enough to reproduce. So what does natural selection work on?
Species.
It works on individuals. And depending on which ones survive and reproduce, that causes the population to have higher frequencies of some alleles and lower frequencies of others. So what evolves? Populations. What does natural selection act on? Individuals. So here's Mr. Joe Beaver. All right, Joe Beaver is an awesome beaver. He's got big shiny teeth and he's got awesome fur, and all the ladies are going, oh, Joe Beaver, he's so wonderful. Okay, he's got this great big flat tail that slacks the water and makes a loud noise, and he loves to show off for the ladies. And so he goes out and he chops down a tree and he's na, biting it all down, and everything is great. Now, here's the next point. Natural selection doesn't work on a single allele at a time. It works on the whole set of alleles that the organism has. So here's Joe Beaver. He's got all these wonderful alleles, but he also happened to have the dumb gene. Okay? So even though he was really good at attracting ladies and he was really good at chopping down trees, he didn't know that while you're standing there watching your awesome tree fall down, you need to step out of the way. Okay? And so he ended up dead. What caused him to die? Natural selection or genetic drift? Natural selection in this case, because he died because he was too dumb to get out of the way of the tree. He didn't check the wind and see which way the tree's going to fall. All right? Now change the scenario. Joe Blow's awesome. All the ladies are looking at him. And just as he's finished chopping down the tree and he's about to step out of the way, because he's checked the wind and he knows where it's coming, one of the ladies says, oh, Joe, we love you. And he turns around to smile at her, and boom, a gust of wind comes and the tree falls down. And now Joe is gone. Did my allele frequencies change? Yes, because Joe's alleles are now gone from the population. What was the cause?
Natural selection.
Natural selection. I mean, no. What's the cause this time?
Genetic drift.
Genetic drift. Why?
Because it was out of luck.
Because it was just dumb luck, just bad luck. He happened to be not paying attention at the critical moment. Okay? So they both can cause evolution to occur, which means allele frequencies in the population changed because we no longer have his alleles because he's dead. Okay? The force, it could be natural selection or it could be genetic drift causing it to happen.
But maybe he had baby before something happened.
Yeah, well, we're assuming he hasn't yet. Okay? All right, now what's gene flow? We're not going to talk much about gene flow, even though it's very important. What that is we have a population of beavers here, and maybe they're all mediocre beavers, and there were no Joe Awesome beavers in this population. But somewhere else a Walmart got built, and Joe Awesome Beaver had to move out. Okay, and he left that environment and he found this pond here, and now he came and is living here instead. Did we just change the allele frequencies just because somebody moved in? That's gene flow. Does gene flow cause you to become better or worse adapted? No. In this case it did, because Joe Blow had awesome alleles. But could it have been Mr. Dumbo Joe that moved in? Okay, and now you've got a bad set of alleles. So those are the three forces that cause evolution. We're going to focus mainly on natural selection because it's what causes species to change over time, populations to change over time, which leads to the development of new species that are better adapted to specific environments. All right, so who came up with all this? Charles Darwin. I would love to spend the whole lecture just talking about Darwin, but we don't have time. So just a quick introduction. He lived in the early 1800s. He was part of a wealthy family. He was an incredibly obedient person, or he cared about his family pride. And back in the 1800s, family pride mattered a lot if you were part of the aristocracy in England. Okay. His father was a doctor, and he wanted Darwin to become a doctor. Darwin did not like this, though, because he had a weak stomach. And they didn't have good anesthesia at this time. And one day, after having to watch a surgery with no anesthesia and watch the patient scream, and everybody's holding their arms down and saying, "Stand still, we're cutting your guts out." And he wrote a letter home and said, "Please, Dad, do I have to be a doctor?" And his dad said, "No, you can become a priest instead. That's a great occupation for somebody of our social status." So he actually went to divinity school, studied to become a priest, was qualified to do that. But meanwhile, he had a strong aptitude for biology. He was one of these people, he's one of the great observers in life. Most of us walk through life with blinders on. We don't notice most of what's going on around us. But he was the kind of kid who would go out in the backyard, lay down, and spend 5 hours watching the ants walk by and take notes on which ant goes where and wonder, why are they doing that and why are they doing that? And he paid attention to things. That was his strength. He was a great, great observer. His professors happened to notice that he had this aptitude for the natural sciences. And a job opportunity came up to go travel on a ship called what? The HMS Beagle, His Majesty's ship, the Beagle. This ship was a military, not military like to fight wars, but it was a government ship. Its job was to go out, travel around the world, and map the coastlines, because this was the age of exploration, or the end of the age of exploration. And so this was where this ship went. He got the job to be the naturalist on board this ship because his professors recommended him. His dad gave him permission to go, and off he went. And on this trip, it was supposed to be a 3-year voyage, I think, but it actually ended up taking 5 years. They went clear around the world, and he went from England, which he thought was incredibly diverse. It's lush and green. There's all kinds of different organisms and things living there. But the first place he stopped was over here in the Azores Islands. And then the next stop was down here in Brazil in the Amazon rainforest. And now all of a sudden, in an area of land the size of this room, he saw more diversity of species than was in all of England. And he started to wonder, I wonder why God put so many more things here than he did there. Why is there such diversity of life, so much more diversity of life here than elsewhere? And he just started to notice things and wonder about things. So he had many stops all along the South American coast and had some major things that he saw. One was down here. There are some cliffs where rocks have fallen off, and there's sedimentary layers of rocks that had tons of fossils in them. And he could look at those and notice that the deeper the layers of rock were, the more primitive and weird looking the organisms looked compared to modern day organisms. But the closer you got to the surface, the more similar they were. And he started to realize that, I've always been taught that God created the world. Zap, there, everything was. And God is perfect, so nothing can change. Species are immutable. That had been his interpretation of how the scriptures should be interpreted and that kind of thing. But they don't actually ever say that. That's just how people started to think. God is perfect. He created everything. Therefore, everything must have been created exactly like how it is now in the perfect form, and nothing can change. Okay, it doesn't actually say that, but that's what people kind of thought. It also said the earth got created in 7 days, and or 6 days, and then you rested. And people thought, so it took a week to make the whole earth. And then that got expanded out. Well, maybe a day means 1,000 years. So they started saying, well, maybe the earth is 7,000 years long, not just whatever. But as he started to look around and had all these experiences, he started to realize the earth is much, much older than that, and started to realize it was hundreds of thousands of years old, maybe even millions of years old. And now the evidence we have tells us the earth is how old? Yeah, 4.6 billion years old, we think, is how old the earth is. And so his whole idea of change had to happen. The point I'm trying to make is most of the controversy between science and religion is from misinterpretations of the scriptures.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? All the scriptures say is God created the earth. It doesn't necessarily say how he did it or how long it took or all those different things. But anyways, so he had all these amazing experiences. Finally, he went out here to the Galapagos Islands, and that's what he's most famous for. But he ended up going clear around the world and then back home again. So a book that he had with him on this journey was Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology. So you should know this person. From reading this book, he learned about the processes of how do you form rock layers. This idea of that rocks are formed by laying down soil, and then heavier things land on top of that, and rocks eventually form. The layers that are deeper down are older than the layers that are further up. And so if you find fossils in the deeper down things, what do you know? Is this older or younger than a fossil you find here? Older. So uniformitarianism, for this to all be true, you have to have an understanding that scientists accept as being true. That the natural processes that form rock and that erode rock away and make cliffs and canyons where we can see these layers occur at essentially a constant rate over geologic time. And based on that, we can measure how long does it take for this little stream to cut out a foot of earth. And then we can estimate back, okay, here's the Grand Canyon that's this deep. How many millions of years must it have taken for doing that? Now, all this I'm oversimplifying a little bit. But from reading this book, what are the two key things that he realized? The earth is very what? Old. Much, much older than he thought. And this was essential for his ideas of evolution to be able to work, because evolution is slow, at least in Darwin's view, which is a gradualistic view. The other thing he saw is that species have definitely changed over time. There's been a lot of different kinds of life forms on Earth. Or in other words, species are not immutable. They change. And then he began to wonder, how did they change? And ultimately came up with the ideas of natural selection. Okay? So the key question he had is, well, there were lots of key questions. So he went to the Galapagos Islands. He saw great diversity of life there. Here's a link to a little movie that will help you understand a little bit about that. I'm not going to take the time to go into the details on this. This is all super interesting history. But the key things that I want you to understand is that he realized that a single species, the original population of finches back on the mainland, could have been blown out by a hurricane out to these islands. The original population had diversity in it, but they all could mate with each other. But some of them had bigger beaks, some of them had littler beaks. Now they ended up on these islands, which were fairly young, geologically speaking, and they had different environments. Some places with big seeds, some places with little seeds, some places with bugs living inside where you had to poke your beak in through a little skinny hole. And now this population of birds that were originally all one species, they went out into different places where there was no competition. There weren't already birds there. And now they could specialize and get really good at just getting your food by poking your beak into a skinny hole and digging out an insect, in which case it's better to have what kind of a beak? A long, pointy, skinny one. And other guys specialized to be really good at eating big, fat seeds, and they had strong, short beaks that could crack the seeds open. And you ended up having one original population give rise to all these different populations. If I'm a big, fat beak bird, is it good or bad if I mate with this bird? It's bad because now my offspring are maybe going to end up somewhere in between, but the food source where this bird lives is big fat seeds, and are my kids going to survive long enough to reproduce? No. So if I also got a mutation so I'm no longer attracted to birds with little skinny beaks, would that be selected for or against? Selected for, because more of my kids would be surviving if I only mate with other ones that are similar to me. And so eventually, once you reach the point where you're no longer mating with each other, you are now different what? Species. And this process of one species giving rise to many different species is called adaptive radiation. We talked about that also on the first day of class, if you recall. Okay, so here's a timeline of Darwin's life, important events that happened. He was born, let's see, right here, 1809. A guy named Lamarck, who was a great scientist and also thought a lot about evolution, published his ideas about evolution in the same year. All right, so Darwin had access to Lamarck's ideas, and he thought about evolution. Darwin also had a grandfather who was very interested in evolution, but everybody thought he was totally nuts. He was like the black sheep of the family. All right, He was exposed to whose book? Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology. He was also exposed to, where is it? Malthus's essay. This was a guy who was worried about overpopulation on the earth and said, well, we won't go into all the details of all the dumb things that he said, but one thing that he said was that, why do we have wars? It's because people are starving to death. And they notice, in the country next door, they have lots of food. We don't have any. Let's just go wipe them out, take all their land, and then we'll have enough. And Darwin read this stuff and realized that there's competition among humans for resources. And he realized it's not just among humans, all species have competition. And you're competing for the same resources, and whoever's best at getting them will live long enough to reproduce, and their traits get passed on. So these ideas, and which taught him about competition, and these ideas, which gave him a long time and an understanding of sedimentation and fossils, helped him develop his ideas of evolution. When he came back from his trip, so he took the trip 1831 to 1836. When he came back from this, he had already developed these ideas, but he did not publish them right away because he had this grandpa who everybody laughed at, and he didn't want to be embarrassed. And so he just kept working on it, but he didn't publish anything because he knew it would cause an uproar as soon as he said species can change over time, and the earth is much, much older than what we think. Because at that time, most people were Christian, and they had a very literal interpretation of the Bible. But then in 1858, a guy named Wallace came around. And Wallace had very similar experiences to everything that Darwin did. He was a great scientist, a great observer. He also worked as a naturalist on a ship that went clear around the world. He saw all similar things that Darwin did, and he came up with very similar ideas. Unfortunately, this guy was not rich, and he was not nearly as lucky as Darwin, and so it was harder for him to get things done. His first trip, the ship sank coming home, so he lost all his samples and all that kind of thing. He had to go out and do it again. But at any rate, he had heard about Darwin's work, and one day he sent a document to him saying, hey, I think this is how the world works. I think this is how species adapt and evolve. And Darwin read this and went, holy cow, those are all my ideas. And so they ended up presenting together, presenting to a group of scientists. But that spurred Darwin to realize, you know what, if I don't publish my work, somebody else is going to get all the credit for it. And so he published his book the next year. And it sold out the first day it was published. Why? Evolution, this idea had been around for thousands of years. Why all of a sudden did it become such a big deal? It's because in his book he had put tons and tons of evidence. He didn't just throw an idea out there. He showed plausible evidence for why it should be true. Okay? And that changed our whole history of how we understand biology and everything. Everything functions on biology. So what do you need to know of all this introduction? You should know Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology. You should know Malthus's essay, taught him about competition. Rainforests of Brazil taught him about incredible diversity on Earth, lots more than what he realized. And the fossils he collected showed that species are not immutable, they do change over time. And then the birds and reptiles here showed that species can change, and we can observe this. And here's another link to a movie. Neither one of these movies I don't love, but they were kind of good. And they're short, they're only like 5 minutes. All right, so next key idea. You have a pretty good idea now of what natural selection is. What is it? Tell each other.
Or you just choose someone to, do that.
Okay, natural selection is a force that causes what? Evolution, which is what? A change in the frequency of alleles in a population over time. Okay? So that's what natural selection is. It allows species to become better adapted to their environment by some guys surviving and other ones not. Artificial selection is great evidence for natural selection, but it is an entirely different process. Artificial selection is almost exactly the same. It causes allele frequencies in a population over time. The difference is it's not random environmental forces causing differential reproductive success. It's humans causing differential reproductive success. This is what happens in dog breeding or cow breeding or any kind of farming, all right? I've got a litter of puppies and I get these really cute ones with, oh, big old eyes and little short curly hair and a knobbly tail, and I think, oh, people would love this. How do I get more dogs like that?
Do it again.
Yeah, I breed that puppy to its siblings, and you breed likes with likes, and in the future litters, all the ones that have curly hair and big cute eyes, I let them mate with each other. But all the ones that don't, back in the day, they throw them in a sack with a rock and drop them in the pond, right? Okay, or is there differential reproductive success? Who's deciding who survives and reproduces? Is it whoever's best at getting resources naturally in the environment? No, it's what the humans think, oh, I like this one. We'll let these guys reproduce. But the process is exactly the same, and that's why it's great evidence for evolution. Natural selection is slow because environmental forces are changing randomly, and you might be favoring this for a while, and then all of a sudden you're not, and now you're favoring this. But in artificial selection, we can change things very rapidly, okay? So here is an example. One of the hobbies of the rich people in Darwin's day was to breed pigeons. Everybody would start out with pigeons that were just your common pigeon. And then they said, okay, let's breed these guys and see who can come up with the coolest pigeons. And then they would have fairs and compare their pigeons. Now, once again, I'm oversimplifying a bit. But they'd get together and have a fair, and here's a really cool pigeon. All right, what happened here? His head is basically growing out of his butt.
What?
All right, so some developmental thing happened that the signaling that goes on in your embryo that says grow a brain and grow teeth and a mouth and all this stuff aren't happening here, it's happening down here instead. So you're getting a perfectly normal head, but it's in the wrong place. Would this bird survive very long in nature? No, because it's really hard to eat when your body's in front of your face, right? But will it survive very long if you're a pigeon breeder trying to come up with the coolest pigeon?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. And so within just a few generations, you can have birds like this that are very different from the original population. Or are we showing that differential reproductive success can change allele frequencies in a population over time?
I can't see his beak. I don't see his face.
No, it's hidden behind. You can see his eye though. Okay, here's another one. Birds don't normally have feathers on their legs because your legs are what you're using to land, and you're flying between branches and things, and those feathers could get broken, and then you would bleed, and then you would attract predators to come and eat you. So some birds have feathers, but most don't. But do they have genes for making feathers? How do you know?
I've seen him.
Because they have feathers all over the rest of their body, and their leg cells have the same DNA in them as all the other cells in their body. It's just here, the promoters for making feathers are never turned on in the legs. But maybe you have a mutation, so you start making this transcription factor in your legs, and now do you turn on the genes for making feathers in the legs? So there's another kind of weird pigeon. And so all these different kinds of pigeons were all developed from that same original one. I call this the deep throat pigeon. Okay, the chicken pigeon. Here's the key point. So just read that instead of me saying it. Okay, so what's the take-home message I want you to understand? Why am I teaching about artificial selection?
Give me the size.
Because it's great evidence that what occurs? Natural selection. But we can observe artificial selection in short periods of time. Within the lifespan of a human, we can see major changes. Our natural selection generally tends to be slow and takes a lot of time. All right, so there's a few more of the cool pigeons. There's a summary of them. Here's another example of artificial selection. How many of you like Brussels sprouts?
Sometimes I do.
Ugh, nasty.
I don't.
With lemon.
Tastes like poo wrapped in cabbage. But I was not a fan of Brussels sprouts, but I've since had them when they're cooked well, and they were actually pretty good. I love broccoli though, and I love cabbage. All right? All of these plants are all derived from the same plant, the wild mustard plant. If you're a good gardener and you select for leaves at the bottom of the plant, you end up with a cabbage. If you select for flowers to get really big at the top of the plant, you get broccoli. If you select for little clumps of leaves all along the stalk, you get Brussels sprouts, and so on and so forth. But you wouldn't guess that all of these are derived from the exact same plant. It's just selective breeding that led to this. This is an example of adaptive radiation. One species giving rise to many different species. But the cause wasn't natural selection, it was what? Artificial selection in this case. But it's the same exact process. That's why it's a good example. Okay? So that's a summary of this. The differential survival of individuals in the natural environment is natural selection. And over time, differential survival causes populations to evolve. Why? What does it mean to evolve?
To
Change the frequency of alleles. And why are the allele frequencies changing? Because,
differential survival.
yeah, individuals with these alleles are surviving, individuals with those aren't, so we're losing the bad alleles. All right, any questions on those concepts? This PowerPoint is posted online, so you can go back and go through it in slower time if you want to. What was the name of Darwin's book?
Alleles? Alleles?
The Origin of Species. The Origin of Species. Okay? He never used the word evolution in that book, but it's what made evolution be accepted broadly throughout the world. He used the term descent with modification. He only has one illustration in the book, and it's this one. He says, I think, this is just in his notes, and he thinks maybe there was some original life form, and it gave rise to lots more, and then something happened to make these three groups different from each other. And these continued on about the same as the original one, but these eventually gave rise to all these other groups, and these gave rise to totally different other groups. Or that's basically how evolution happens. So here's Darwin's original drawing, and here's kind of a modern idea. This isn't the original organism, but here's a protist, we think, gave rise to all the plants. So the algae ones gave rise to things that eventually became photosynthetic plants, and then all the other different kinds of organisms. Everybody's related to each other. Common ancestry is the big theme in evolution. Why do we have unity in life? Because we ultimately, if you go back far enough, we all come from the same original ancestor. That's what Darwin proposed. And gradually, over time, the offspring of these things accumulated different sets of changes that led to all the diversity of life that we have now. Why do we have diversity of life? Because of mutation, which gives you something for natural selection to select, and because of different environments. Not everything lives in the same environment. All right, Darwin's finches are an excellent example of the relatedness of species, or adaptive radiation. So what should you know so far? Who's the father of evolution, and what are some experiences that Charles Darwin, and
He rode his boat.
a trip on what boat?
The DMS.
HMS Beagle.
Beagle, yeah.
Beagle, okay. What essay did he read? Malthus's essay. What book did he read?
With the Lyell's essay.
Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. Okay, what's the driving force that leads to adaptation? Natural selection, yes. What other forces are there that can cause evolution, but not necessarily cause you to be better adapted to your environment? Genetic drift and gene flow. What is the simple genetic definition of evolution?
Changing alleles over time.
Change in the frequency of alleles in a population over time. And where do you get new alleles from?
Parents.
Mutation.
No mutation.
Mutation.
Same thing.
Okay? All right. And then how does natural selection work? So we've talked about all those things. So those are key ideas. The next lecture on Wednesday, we'll be looking at how does natural selection work in a lot more detail. We're just introducing everything right now. Okay, so the result of natural selection is that what evolves?
Environments.
Populations, not what?
Individuals.
Not individuals. Individuals, you can't change your frequency of alleles. But can the frequency of alleles in the population change depending on whether I reproduce or not? Okay. All right. Now, there were other views of evolution. We talked about Lamarck. Darwin was exposed to Lamarck's ideas. Lamarck was actually a brilliant scientist and had lots of great ideas about evolution. But unfortunately, he had one idea that was wrong. And so he's remembered as the guy who was wrong. All right? He came up with a theory of evolution that was very similar to Darwin's, but the mechanism was different. What's Darwin's mechanism? natural selection. Lamarck's mechanism was inheritance of acquired traits. And what acquired traits mean is I can go down, I have these skinny flabby arms, but I could go to the gym and I could work out and get awesome muscles and awesome arms. And if Lamarck's theory was true, then when I have kids, they will have what? Nice muscles and no flabby arms. Okay? Can you actually do that? No, because those acquired characteristics are not actually heritable. So that was the difference. If Lamarck's ideas were true, could you take this is a bonsai tree. Do you all know what bonsai trees are? No. They're trees that have been trimmed and nurtured ever since the seed first germinated by a master gardener. So it develops to look like a full-size tree, but it's only maybe a few feet tall. Okay? Very, very beautiful trees. If Lamarck's hypothesis was true, if I took seeds from this tree and planted them, what would I get? A full-size pine tree or a bonsai tree? A bonsai tree. But if you actually take one of those seeds and plant it and don't tend it, just let it grow, what are you going to get? A full-size tree. Okay? So Lamarck's is inheritance of acquired characteristics. So now let's compare Darwin's ideas to Lamarck's ideas about how giraffes got long necks. In Lamarck's hypothesis, everybody started out the same. They all had short necks. But there was competition for food, and up in the trees here were leaves that nobody was eating. So what did these giraffes do? They reached up to try to reach the leaves, and they stretched their necks and their legs, and they got a little bit longer. And then when they had kids, what did their kids have? A little bit longer legs and necks. And they stretched even more, and eventually we have modern giraffes that have nice long necks that can reach everything. They don't have to stretch anymore. Okay? Inheritance of what? Acquired characteristics. The key difference is, in Darwin's idea, we don't start out where all the giraffes are the same. We start out with what?
Different.
Variation in the population. Why is there variation? Is it because this giraffe said, I want to be able to eat the tall trees, so I'm going to make some mutations so I have longer necks?
No, just evolution.
Yeah. Do mutations happen because you want them to or randomly?
Randomly happen.
Randomly. And are most mutations good or bad?
It depends.
If you're randomly changing things, just throwing rocks at your car, are you more likely to make it better or make it worse? Yeah. It's either going to have no effect or it's going to make it worse. But every once in a while, could something happen to make things better? Okay? So we have difference in alleles because of random mutations. But now the environment says it's better to have short necks or long necks?
Long necks.
Long necks in this case. So who survives long enough to reproduce?
Longer neck.
The guys with the long necks, and therefore do more of the offspring in the next generation have longer necks? Because the guys with long necks were able to reproduce. And eventually we led to modern giraffes. Could we have the same thing if we lived in an environment with really low branches? Then it would be really bad to have long necks, and who'd be selected for? The short neck guys. Okay. This we've talked about before. Natural selection doesn't create new traits, but it selects for traits that are already present in the population. How did they get there? From random mutations. And then what determines if a trait is a good trait or a bad trait? The actual environment that you live in. So here are two praying mantises. They're both praying mantises. This guy lives in Malaysia, and he lives on these plants that have beautiful pink flowers. So he has evolved to look like a beautiful pink flower. Why is this an advantage?
Because it camouflage.
Yeah, camouflage. Is he less likely to get eaten by the birds? Because he looks like a flower and not a bug. And why else is it an advantage? Yeah, he can sneak up on the things that he's eating because they think he's a flower, not a predator. Okay? Same thing here, only this guy lives on the ground where there's lots of dead brown leaves. So what does he look like?
Pretty accurate.
A dead brown leaf. They're both awesome mutations, but if I put this guy in that environment, would it be good anymore? No. So we've talked about that a lot. Any questions on that idea? Okay. Why do I have different sets of alleles in these praying mantises than I do in that one?
Different genes.
Because of natural selection. We live in different environments. Here's an environment with brown leaves. It's better to look like a brown leaf in this environment. All right, here's a classic example is the soapberry bugs. So these bugs like to eat a fruit called, I always forget what it's called, the native balloon vine. All right, and these have kind of a thick husk, and then it sticks its proboscis through this husk, and then it can get to the stuff inside and eat it. All right? Then a not native tree in Florida got introduced. This one is called the golden rain tree. And these bugs can also eat this fruit, but these guys have a lot thinner husk. So if you have a really long proboscis, it just goes clear through to the other side, and you can't actually eat it. And so what do you think is going to happen to the length of the proboscis over time? Or form a hypothesis of what you think would happen if we live in an environment where I have golden rain trees and none of the natural trees. Yeah, would you expect them to get shorter over time? And here's some data. When you collect these bugs where you have the native tree, the average beak length is between here and here, or the average is about 9.5 millimeters. But if you live on the introduced species, your average is about 7 millimeters. What caused the allele frequencies to change and to be shorter? Natural selection, because we had a different food source available and it was better to work that way. All right. The theory of evolution is called a theory, not a hypothesis. Why? Because there's lots of evidence supporting this theory. It's not just some idea that somebody threw out there. There's all kinds of evidence. And one of the classic evidences is that things become resistant to drugs. So the same problem with antibiotics. Bacteria become resistant to that. Here it was a pesticide, not an antibiotic, that killed mosquitoes. When they first introduced DDT, 4% of the mosquitoes that were exposed to it lived. 96% died. It was a wonder drug. Great way, just get rid of the mosquitoes. But what are we doing over time? We're selecting for the few individuals who have a slightly different chemical makeup that DDT doesn't affect. And even though their makeup wasn't as good at competing against these guys in the normal environment, now that there's DDT around, does this suddenly become better? Because even though it's not as good, I'm not dead. Okay? And within just 8 years, 45% of the mosquitoes lived. And within 12 years, 77% survived. This is natural selection that is causing the allele frequencies to change. So there are lots of evidences for evolution. I'm not going to go through all of these, but your homework does a little bit and your reading does. But just the way we classify life is evidence for evolution. We group things in based on how related they are to each other. There's anatomical similarities, so I'm going to talk about a few of these. Here's one important evidence for evolution. We can look at all these organisms. Pretend like you can't see their bones. We're just looking at the wing of a bat, the flipper of a sea lion, the forelimb of a lion, the hand of a human. Do they look very similar on the outside? Do my hands look very much like bat wings? No, they look totally different on the outside. But if you look on the inside, we all have the exact same bone structure. We all have a single humerus bone, 2 bones in the next area, the radius and ulna, and then a whole bunch of phalanges and carpals and metacarpals. And all of them have the exact same bones. The only thing that's different is the genes. When I turn on the gene to make a humerus, there's other genes that if I'm a whale, it says make it really short and really wide. But if I'm a human or a chimp, make it really long and skinny. And so the final limbs end up looking different from each other. This idea where structures look different superficially on the outside, but are actually built very similarly on the inside, is called homology. And whenever you see homology, this is evidence that species are closely related because they've inherited the ability to make limbs. They know how to make a humerus, a radius, and ulna, and all the other bones, but they adapt how they make those limbs, so I end up with different structures that perform different functions. So homologous structures are when you look different superficially, but when you look deeper, you're actually very, very similar. You're made the same way. And it's evidence of what? Being closely related or being very different?
Close.
Closely related. Analogous structures are when superficially you look the same, like the wing of a butterfly and the wing of a bird. They're both big, broad, flat surfaces. They look the same. But are butterflies and birds very closely related? No. The way you build a bird wing is with bones. The way you build a butterfly wing is with totally different structures. Okay? So even though they look similar, they're not related at all. So homologous and analogous structures, you should know that. This leads to 2 kinds of evolution. In divergent evolution, you start with one original species that has some variation in it, and it gives rise to multiple species that are all quite different from each other, or divergent evolution. Another way to say it is my frequency of alleles. If I have a graph here, and this is the number of alleles, most organisms have these alleles, but a few have these traits and a few have these traits. If you have divergent evolution, then what you're doing is something happens in the environment, so now I'm selecting for these guys, and I'm selecting for these guys, but I'm selecting against those. And now have I just changed what used to be one interbreeding population into two different populations that look different from each other? And if they acquire enough traits that they no longer breed, now I have different what? Different species. But are they closely related to each other? They came from the same common ancestor. How would I know they were closely related? What kind of structures would I see if I looked at them? Analogous ones or homologous ones? Homologous ones. So divergent evolution is when one population gives rise to many populations. They look different, but they're actually closely related. Some other evidence for evolution is the way we develop. All chordates go through stages during development where they look like this. They all have a fairly big head, a huge long tail, and guts and stuff in between, and they're forming a brain. So here's 6 different kinds of organisms. Which one do you think is the human?
It's the one in the middle, like that one right there.
This one?
No, right.
This one?
Right.
This one?
Right. Go right.
This one? Okay, so he's saying this one's human. Does everybody agree?
No.
Okay, which one do you guys think?
That's a trick question.
Pardon?
That's a trick question. Like it's like none of them are human.
One of them is human.
Oh, one of them is? Okay.
Yep.
Or it's the one on the other side.
Okay, a lot of times people choose this one because it has a huge head. And what's characteristic of humans? Big, huge brains. All right, this is a little bit later in evolution, and we're starting to see some differences here. But you still can't really tell them apart. They all still have a big long tail and kind of a big mess in between, right? Big head and that kind of thing. But here are the actual differences. This one here is the human.
Oh, wow.
All right? And so it looks very different to begin with. But now, a late embryo, now can I see very distinct differences between them? So we all start out the same, basically as a blob with a head, a big long tail, some organs forming, and a brain and an eye. And they're all chordates, so they all have a spinal cord. But then as development goes on, the human tail doesn't grow. So you all have a tail, but it's kind of tucked down and it's really tiny because we don't need it. But other organisms, the tail does keep growing. And
That doesn't even look like a baby. It just looks like a stomach with like intestines.
yeah. It's because we're so complex, it takes a lot longer to get things started, to pattern and decide where everything's going to be. But then once it starts growing, we get all our individual parts. Okay? So why do we all go through these same phases? Everything has, at this point, we all have pharyngeal slits right here. If you was a fish, that will eventually become your gills. But we don't need gills because we have what? Lungs to breathe. So those slits instead become entirely different things. And like your jawbone and your incus and malleus and the different things in your ear, the different bones in your ear. So you have, well anyways, I'm talking about fun stuff that I like. The point is we all start out the same. This is evidence that we all inherited genes, that this is how you develop and originally pattern the organism. But then we become different later on by turning on different genes that say how big this should become versus how big this, how many limbs should we make, and all that kind of stuff. Another great evidence for evolution is fossils. This is the classic Mendelian idea of evolution, that it occurs gradually over time. If I only had this fossil and that one, would I ever think this was the ancestor of a horse? No, it's about the size of a fox. It had 4 toes. Modern horses have 1, and they're much, much bigger. But because we have fossils of every stage in between, we can see that this thing gave rise to that. All right, we will end there. I didn't get quite as far as I hoped to, but we have a really good introduction. I'll finish up these ideas next time, and then we'll start the second half where we look at natural selection in detail. You'll learn 3 different ways natural selection can work. directional, disruptive, or stabilizing. And we also need to learn how Hardy-Weinberg works. But other than that, we're close to done. So, good work.